I'm Shauna Dillavou. I started about a year and a half ago an organization called CommunityRED. After working in the intelligence community for 5 years, I realized that my work wasn't really doing much for lots of reasons. It was kind of a broken system. But I also realized that the people I was working for, that I was watching, you could say, in Mexico at that time, 2011, 2012, more and more of them were getting killed for reasons that didn't really make any sense. They weren't journalists, they weren't activists, they weren't citizen journalists. They were just regular people tweeting the whereabouts of cartel shootouts or checkpoints or whatever. And for it, they were being gruesomely mutilated, murdered in a very public fashion. And so at some point I was like, I can't keep doing this, making a ton of money as a contractor, doing, whatever, observation, and not really doing anything to make a difference for these folks. And one of the things that we've noticed over the last year and a half is that more and more people need help with digital security. So my whole thesis was, look, I've been trained in these tools. I know how to mitigate my digital footprint. I just gotta tell these guys, which turns out isn't that simple. And what we found over the last year and a half is that a lot of people, an increasing and expanding pool of people need support in these digital tools. So when we started to formulate this idea back in January, around the development sector, so international development organizations, international organizations, governments, all we kept thinking about were the nightmare scenarios. So like a development agency would be mapping a community's HIV positive population, saving that data potentially on an unencrypted hard drive, because that's pretty much what we all do anyway, and then passing through a border or a checkpoint, or worse, losing the drive. That's not hard to do. So it's awful when it happens in Belize. It's like a ton of your work gone and potentially somebody could see it, but no big deal. But it's like life-threatening if it were to happen in Uganda. Or for an international organization to pass cell phones out to farmers in the developing world, like candy to kids on Halloween. This happens all the time. It helps them, no doubt, to get involved in commerce, sending and receiving payments, growing their business. I've personally been working on trying to find a solution for that for Zapotec lady borrowers, part of a microfinance organization in Oaxaca. It's empowering. But in our race to blanket the developing world with technology, no doubt to make those economies viable and sort of the mass globalized economy, and the individuals actual viable participants in those economies, we take what seems totally innocuous and make it dangerous. In large part, it's not on purpose. I mean, it's not people doing this because they, the idea is to do no harm. In large part, the danger is coming out of this confluence of mass surveillance programs that are proliferating. Like across the globe, we're seeing more and more of them. And the proliferation of development programs. So you see this sort of confluence of these two things. And then training those populations that these programs the development programs create, that to now rely on information and communications technologies. So we're creating a sort of a dependent developing world on ICT. And then on top of that, you are having an increasing number of governments buy into the mass surveillance, including this one. Well, so let me explain. The proliferation of mass surveillance technologies in the developing world was largely unknown to the public until the events of the Arab Spring in 2011. That shed light on some of the tools like FinSpy, FinFisher, SORM, all the really big, nasty malwares, the use of them by authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes. So those technologies and these guys will talk more about that, have dramatically concentrated power in the hands of governments, limit the ability of populations and development organizations to succeed in promoting freedom, democracy, human prosperity, et cetera, all the things that we work for. So the way we see it at this intersection is a new battlefield for the promotion of human development and freedom, pitting the development sector against these authoritarian governments or these third-party oppressors. And that, frankly, that shit's an uneven playing field. On the one hand, I mean, that's a dramatic understatement. It's a battle where you've got sort of these undersourced people already, a development sector that's trying their best to plug all the holes in the dike, and then you've got billions spent on mass surveillance technologies. We're getting totally creamed in that regard. So that begs the question, what do we do? And the other question, which I'll address, who do we look to do it? Okay, so I'll start with that second question because that's something I kind of have an answer for. On whom does it fall to provide training, tools, et cetera, to maintain privacy and integrity of devices and data? That's a question that we've been grappling with quite a bit. The easy answer is, well, development agencies and international organizations need to integrate privacy and anonymity tools and data policies into their operating procedures. Well, no, duh. Like, of course they do. The slightly less easy answer is that donors, development organizations, and the populations they serve, and the internet freedom community, and hopefully some participatory governments, sorry, it's a little early still, have to confront these challenges cooperatively and candidly. Let's break that down a little bit first. Because if that were something that were possible and easy, it probably would have already been done. The urban planner in me is like, that's like asking people to just build more lanes to alleviate bad traffic. Well, it's just gonna fill up with more cars. It's not gonna, obviously the solution is a little more difficult. If it were that easy, it would have been done by now, okay? So looking at that, the constraints that some of these organizations deal with are things that we really have to take into mind. I mean, they're working to stay in those countries. They're not trying to piss off the host governments. So if they're telling somebody, oh, use this VPN or use encryption when those things are actually illegal in that country, that might end all of their programming there. It might end all of the help that they're doing. A lot of these agencies are subject to FOIA and other USG rules. I mean, a pal of mine at USAID can't send encrypted mails. OSF can't send encrypted mails. So what can they do? You know, how can they work around that? That's an example, and this might not be a very popular belief, but it's an example of where transparency in government may not be the most useful for people that the government is working with. And it's not clear to me, as a circumvention person, how to get the right people at the table. We held an event in DC back in May around ICT for D, so communications technologies for development sector, right? And a lot of IT people were there, but not program staff. But if you get the program staff in the room, then you have to, how can you get the decision makers actually there? We talked to a lot of program staff that are super frustrated about how their organization is operating, but they don't even know. They're asking us to help them make a case to their decision makers, their bosses. Finally, it's a capacity question. I was at a conference in November talking about these issues, and an entire group of participants was like, oh, as a donor, you should just work it into the RFP that this agency or these organizations on the ground have to incorporate a security plan. And I was like, how? How are they gonna do that? If it's a 3-person organization, they're barely scraping by. Like, how are you gonna expect them to know that stuff and then add it and then follow through on it? Because you know that's gonna be monitored and evaluated, the shit out of it. So that's like huge on slimming down options for people. A couple of other, folks that you would want to have at the table might be the people often say, like the Googles, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the big tech giants should be at the table. Okay, I can see that their leadership in the tech world and the money they make off these markets makes them a responsible party for security. But do we want to trust them implicitly with this stuff? I mean, that's a question we need to ask. And how do we weigh that trust against perceived resources or abilities of these giant companies to help? And frankly, why would we just stop at tech companies if we're going to go down that route? There are lots of major US-based companies like a Coca-Cola or McDonald's that operate in those places too. Why don't we bring them to the table if we're going to bring in corporations? And then there's governments, and I think the same questions apply about trust and about limitations of their support. So I'd like to talk more about possible methods, best practices, shared responsibilities, even a working model if folks are interested. Before I do that, I'm going to pass it off to Tim and Danielle to hit on some important options for what to do that we may not have considered before answering, before I continue. So you guys go ahead.
Thanks a lot, and good morning, everybody. My name is Tim. I'm a research fellow at the Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New America Foundation, a independent, nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. And we've been working on export controls for about a year and a half now. And the reason why we started focusing on this is, as Shauna just outlined, after the Arab Spring, you had a number of reports that not only showed the extent of the surveillance against people in developing countries, and particularly places like Syria, but also Libya, but you also had new evidence emerge about technologies produced in the US and in Europe that were used for this type of surveillance. And after the initial press reports, and Danielle and I have been working on this together, and she'll talk a little bit more about another piece of this work later on. You also had universities starting to look into this and more research being done. So primarily the Citizen Lab in Toronto has done some terrific work actually analyzing what type of technologies are we talking about that was found in these places and what were they used for. So, and this has been going on for about 3 to 4 years now. And when we started looking into this a year and a half ago, we came to realize that we gotten to a point where there was sufficient data and evidence about what had been going on, but that there was a gap in trying to figure out, okay, what can we do about it from a policy perspective? And one of the options that the government has available are export controls, which are essentially the legal basis for the government to review exports of certain items. This includes goods and services to another country prior to the export taking place. And the government can actually do a thumbs up or thumbs down of whether the export can go through or not. And this is for a very small percentage of overall U.S. exports where such a legal basis applies that the item falls under the specific classification. And so we decided that we would spend some time trying to figure out what do current export control regulations actually cover already. So we teamed up with Privacy International in the UK and a German NGO called Digitale Gesellschaft and spent a good year just doing the analysis, working with our technologists of what kind of technologies are we concerned with and going through the research reports of what kind of technologies are we talking about. And then the policy analysis of actually going into the export control regimes in those 3 countries and trying to figure out what is the status quo of what is currently being covered. And this all then culminated in a report that is called Uncontrolled Global Surveillance that we published earlier this year. And what we found was that apart from a few instances, the current export control regulations have become outdated and in many ways do no longer cover technologies that were found to have been used by these regimes and technologies that were actively exported by European and American companies. That was one of the findings in the report. What we also did was we looked into existing human rights provisions in the export control regime. The export control regime traditionally comes from a security space where we have an arms control regime and then we have the dual use control regime. The initial impetus was trying to prevent the export of military goods to other countries that aren't friendly to the government that is imposing the export controls. But you've had over time a number of provisions that have a human rights impetus. So for example, in the crime controls, handcuffs are one of the easy examples to give, that handcuffs are controlled and cannot be exported to certain countries. So this report also outlines what kind of provisions already exist that can serve as a precedent for creating new controls that would cover technologies that can be used for surveillance, and to do so not from a security perspective, but from a human rights perspective. And that became the second step of what we were trying to do with the project, which was developing recommendations for creating controls covering such technology. Now, what happened, and I'm sure all of you love when that happens, is you're in the midst of a research project and then something happens that makes you adjust the research project because you didn't see it coming, which happened in December when actually 41 governments that are part of what's called the Wassenaar regime decided to create 2 new controls specifically relating to surveillance. So this is one control is specifically on IP network surveillance systems, which is a very narrowly crafted control, which has, I think, 7 subcomponents, all with and conjunctions. So you have to satisfy all 7 of them together with each other. And this was based on a French proposal after the French government got a lot of criticism with regard to the Amicis case. So this is one control that was created, we believe, in direct response to that political backlash, and is also very narrowly tailored. The other control is broader and focuses on intrusion software. There's been some reporting on where the definition of intrusion software was confused with the actual control. So you have two pieces of that. You have, sorry, now I'm getting into the weeds, so we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but you have essentially two components of this, this other control, where one, you have a definition of intrusion software, and then you have the outline of the actual control. And it's important to keep the two separate. There were some blog posts that mistook the definition of intrusion software as the actual control, but what is actually controlled is the command and control infrastructure that is being used for the intrusion software. So it's not the intrusion software itself, but it's the commercial, the target of the control is the commercial infrastructure that's been used by like Finn Fisher, for example, and Gamma for these type of surveillance systems. So there's right now the stage of the 41 governments agreed to these new controls and the language in December, and it's now up to the 41 governments to implement those controls in their national regimes. So in the second phase that I just alluded to, we took it a step further, didn't just look at the status quo of the export control regimes, but developed a set of recommendations for how to implement these two controls in the US export control regime. And those recommendations are on our website as well, which we developed together with a group of other organizations, including Internews, including Access Now, and Colin Anderson, an independent researcher, was very helpful in putting them together. And in those recommendations, we outline how we think the controls could be implemented with a human rights framework behind them, so that they're as strong as necessary from a human rights perspective to make sure that these type of technologies do not get exported to countries that have a very bad track record when it comes to human rights. So that is the export control work that we've done, and the export control regime as such covers all countries in the world. So it's a universal regime that then gets differentiated based on what is the end user and the end destination of the good and items, and you have a more nuanced system. The other piece to that is the sanctions regimes that the US has in place, which the comprehensive sanctions target only 5 countries in the world. So there are specific regimes only for 5 specific countries. And Danielle is going to talk more about that.
Thanks, Tim. Can everyone hear me? All 12 of you? No, I didn't count. Actually, that was a guess, but it might be right. So as Tim mentioned, I'm Danielle Kehl. I'm a policy analyst at the Open Technology Institute at New America, and I'm going to talk about an issue that I think in some ways bridges the gap between what Shauna was talking about and what Tim was talking about, because we're talking about the 5 countries that the U.S. has comprehensive sanctions against, which are, Iran, Syria, Sudan, Cuba, and North Korea, which are 5 of the most challenging environments in the world. These are places that have, in many, they have very repressive governments. There's populations that are, looking for ways to communicate, that are getting access to new technologies and new tools, not always with the security knowledge that they need, and also not always with the ability to access the actual versions of the tools or the tools they want. And one of the big reasons for that is the actual policies that we have in place, so the sanctions policies. So we all know, I think, the media has well covered the role that communications tools played in the Green Movement in Iran and in the Arab Spring, not just on the censorship and surveillance side, so what was revealed afterwards, after the Arab Spring, about what the governments were doing, but also in terms of the use of social media tools, the use of apps like WhatsApp to communicate. There's all kinds of examples of tools that didn't exist maybe 10 or 20 years ago that really helped people communicate with one another, to organize, to express things, to record events and share them with the outside world. And so, I think the value of those tools was demonstrated in a lot of ways. They didn't in any way cause these events, but they certainly helped amplify them. They helped people, share their stories. And so the value of those tools was well established, but one of the big challenges is that many of those tools are created by American companies or Western companies, which means that they're subject to U.S. export rules and to U.S. sanctions. And so when you're talking about Iran and Syria and Sudan in particular, it's not just whether or not the individuals living in those countries, whether or not they have to get around the government censorship that exists and the attempts to block access. They're also actually navigating this in this difficult area where U.S. companies may be blocking them on their side. because they're afraid of violating U.S. sanctions. So this is a big challenge. Technically, making Gmail available in a foreign country is an export of a U.S. product, which maybe seems a little bit counterintuitive, but it's produced here in the U.S. by an American country, and therefore it's subject to the rules. So what essentially has happened in the past few years is that recognizing that this is a new kind of challenge, the U.S. government, and this has been with help and input from a lot of civil society groups and also in consultation with a lot of companies, has looked for ways to sort of carve holes in our sanctions regime, similar to the way we do for humanitarian goods like food and medicine for communications tools. So what we have said is initially in 2010, and this was especially after the Green Movement, basic free personal communications tools that are freely available to the public for download, that are mass market, that can be used by individuals, so consumer grade. So that, and this is also to be cognizant always that you're making sure that while you're trying to make these useful tools available, you're not touching on the type of censorship and surveillance technology that we talk about, so that you're not making it easier for governments to censor and surveil people, but that you're making it easier for individuals to communicate. So the U.S. government said these tools are allowed to be made available in Iran and Sudan and Cuba, and then later they said the same for Syria. So that kind of started to help the problem a little bit. It made tools like Gmail, and it gave clear legal authority for a company like Twitter and for some of the other kind of chat services to make their tools available to people. It didn't cover a whole bunch of things that were very important, and that were very important not just for communications but also for digital security. And that was a lot of antivirus software, a lot of security updates, virtual private networks and other proxy tools, lots of the kinds of things that people in these countries rely on to get access to outside information and communications outside the country, but also to communicate more securely. And so one of the big challenges created by this U.S. policy is, in addition to blocking access, what we've actually seen is that it's not that people then don't use tools at all, right? They turn to less secure alternatives. So tools that may be produced in country that may actually be influenced by the government. And we've seen also examples where government may there may be malware that's masquerading as a virtual private network or another proxy tool, and that means that you as an individual looking for a more secure way to communicate are actually exposing yourself to direct government surveillance. Or they download bootleg versions of an operating system or of mobile apps, which again often come with, they may come with malware, but even if they don't, they're often out of date, right? And so they don't have key security patches that you would get as an ordinary user, and that means that the government probably also knows how to exploit them, right? So we've seen the government of Iran and of Syria build up these sophisticated censorship and surveillance networks. We're seeing this in Sudan as well. They are getting better and better at employing, hackers on their side to try to figure out how they can exploit any vulnerabilities in these software so that they can track people. Because they're concerned that as people talk and share ideas, that they may turn on the governments, or that it may lead to the kind of sort of democratic movement that is threatening to these governments. And I think that's a very real concern. That's the events of the past few years have shown us that. And so you have this problem that people can't get access to security updates. So even if you have Microsoft Windows, and even if you have a real version that's out of date, when you try to communicate from Iran with Microsoft servers to download the latest security patch, they're blocking it because it's coming from an Iranian IP address, and they're required to do so by law. That has a very real cost. It can expose people to more censorship and surveillance. It can also cost people their lives. It can force people to have to flee because their devices have been compromised and it's no longer safe for them. And so I think there are examples. You've seen people who've had to leave, especially in a country like Syria, when they're doing great work and when they're helping people, because their devices have been compromised and they don't know what could happen. So this has all been a problem, and I think it's recognized as a problem. And last May, the U.S. government for Iran, leading up to the presidential election, recognizing this was a problem, issued a new general license, so a blanket authorization for any company that whose products met the requirements that they were describing for a whole range of other tools. And this was software, hardware, services. So this was everything from laptops and mobile phones to antivirus software, operating systems, mobile app stores, to be made available in Iran, which is it's a really significant step. Nothing like that has ever happened before in the history of U.S. sanctions with this kind of sort of like broad authorization. And the idea is that this makes it easier for ordinary individuals to get access to these tools, and it helps the companies, because a lot of these companies want to essentially, what I would say is, do the right thing. They want to help. They are not intentionally trying to block these tools, but they're very concerned about the risk. It's a huge risk, financial as well as political, if you violate U.S. sanctions. And so they need all the legal cover that they can get, essentially, before they can do this. So that was a significant step, and I think one of the big things to put in perspective is, if it was really hard for a big company like Google or like Samsung to make, even not talking about selling phones or hardware, but even making Google Chat or like Google Code or the Android App Store available in a sanctioned country. Imagine how daunting that is for a small developer, a single developer, or a small NGO that's trying to build digital security tools or something. And so what was happening is, you're facing the wall of U.S. sanctions and these huge penalties, which could wipe you out if you're a small organization. That's going to be a big deterrent. And so you may say, I'm not going to make my products available in Iran or Syria, because there's this huge concern. And if you're a development organization, you are thinking about, well, what can we do? Because there are authorizations for a lot of development organizations to go into these countries to provide humanitarian aid, food and medical supply to respond to disasters. This is because the idea is that we don't want sanctions to harm populations. If they cause harm on ordinary individuals, that's kind of counter to the idea. The idea is to impose a cost on governments and try to force a behavior change, not to harm ordinary individuals. That's a lesson that was learned in the 80s and 90s, as we saw kind of the detrimental effects on the population of U.S. sanctions. So we've seen some progress here, but there's a lot more to be done. It's still very challenging, and a lot of the policies actually only apply to Iran. So they don't apply to Syria or Sudan. In Sudan right now I think it doesn't actually get nearly as much media attention, unfortunately, but for the past about almost 2 years, there have been a series of sort of student protests and uprisings. They have been greatly enabled by the availability of communications tools. And this is because the Sudanese government also is increasingly building up its censorship and surveillance capability. So ordinary individuals are turning away from text messaging, which may be easy to monitor, towards other types of apps that they think are more secure. They actually use WhatsApp a lot, which is an interesting example. But and one of the reasons why is they're using what's available, right? So they're turning to the tools that are available, and it's a huge problem. And so when you put this all together, what you see is that there's this digital security education gap. So people are going out into the field without the right tools, or people who live in these countries don't have access or don't know what it is what's better and what's worse. They don't know the trade-offs. You have these American and European companies sort of in some ways facilitating the problem that Tim described, which is the availability of the censorship and surveillance technology for the government or for other sort of even non-state actors. They're increasing that capability if they're making their products available. And then you have U.S. policies in sanctioned countries that are making it exceptionally more difficult for NGOs and for ordinary individuals to access tools. So even if they actually do know what are the best tools to use, they may not be able to access them. And it may be as simple as a company not understanding the policy, or the U.S. policy not taking that into account. And so, they're not getting the critical software updates they need, or the antivirus software that they need to protect themselves. And that's in these really high stakes environments a lot of times, like Iran and Syria and Sudan. So I think we've kind of described a massive problem here. It has a lot of angles, and what Tim and I have looked at in our work has been one sort of small piece, and not insignificant, but small, which is the U.S. government policies that affect this. There's so much more that goes into it beyond that, because it's not just as simple as, and I think we've seen that with sanctions, especially changing the U.S. policy and fixing the problem. There are, what ordinary individuals and organizations do. There's the education challenge. There's the role of private companies. So having kind of put that in a large frame, and I'm going to hand it back to Shauna.
No, I think I have a few questions, but I'd like to open it up to see if anyone in the audience has any questions. Don't be shy.
We know it's early.
Okay, I'll start. Do you see any changes? So given the Iran example where we opened stuff up, have we seen any changes? Have you guys seen that in your work, any research? And what is the potential then for scaling is the wrong word, but like, what is the potential then for sort of grafting a similar response onto the other 4 sanctioned countries?
So we have seen some changes in the past year. So a couple examples, Google and Apple unblocked their app stores, their mobile app stores in Iran and in last summer, which was a huge step actually, because there are lots of apps. I think the Guardian Project is a really good example. Like there are lots of apps that are available that people couldn't get access to before because the gateway is the app store. So that was a big step. We also saw one thing that was an interesting lesson, and this is sort of that these policies are not one-time fixes, they're very iterative, is that in February, the U.S. government actually issued a revised license. So General License D was the license that covered mobile phones and laptops and all of these variety of products. They issued a revision, and it didn't change the technologies that were made available, but it changed the definitions to make them more precise, and it added in a whole bunch more language that was really useful. There were a lot of unforeseen problems that I think because this is such a new issue, and one of them being the challenge of normally we talk about, the license talked about U.S. persons or persons located in the United States exporting technology, and so that means and U.S. persons, that includes companies. Oddly enough, not for the same companies as people, but that it included, so if you were a company located in the United States, you could export, if you fit the parameters of the license, you could export your products. Or if you were an American company located anywhere in the world. What it didn't include was non-U.S. persons located not in the United States, which it would seem, if you're a company based in South Korea that makes mobile phones, why would you be subject to U.S. sanctions, except that if your mobile phones run the Android operating system on them, you are subject to U.S. sanctions because the Android operating system is a U.S. product. So now you have to go figure out how to get a special license if you want to export your product, even though you're not an American company and not located here. So they fixed a lot of those problems, which was really great. So we've seen small changes. The second part of the question, how do we expand this to other countries? I think it actually also reinforces, expanding it to other countries will help make more room for there to be more companies that actually make their products available everywhere. So the reason why I say this is because essentially for companies, they build these complicated compliance systems to deal with sanctions, and the policies are different for every single country. So it's much easier to have an overly compliant policy for all of the sanctioned countries, so to block your product everywhere, because the challenge of keeping up with this, and you have these small teams that are dealing with all the export regulations, is very large, and it's at the moment for very small payoff, right? Because you still, although financial transactions for the Iranian example are technically authorized, it's really hard. They've always seen that problem with humanitarian goods, the challenge of actually getting paid for these things. So there's not a huge amount of payoff. So a lot of this is doing it for the reason that you recognize the value of these tools, or because there's hope that at some point when there will be a regime change, there'll then be a legitimate market for your products. So if you are a company, you're concerned that you don't necessarily want to be the first company to step out in front on this issue. And secondly, you don't want to individually unravel the systems that you've built up, first for Iran and then for Sudan and then for Syria, or have them all be very different. So if the authorization exists across the board, you can say, great, this product that we make that used to be blocked by U.S. sanctions is now authorized, and we can kind of just remove that block for everything, because a lot of it is blocking downloads on your website. And so you get a request from an IP address in any of these 5 countries, and you block it, and you throw up a page that says, sorry, we can't do this because of U.S. sanctions. So that will help a lot. So I think actually expanding it, it's as simple, and it's not actually very simple, but it's as simple as crafting a similar policy for the one that exists for Iran for the other, through U.S. sanctions regulations for the other countries. And then you'd have a relatively harmonized approach to these tools. And then also secondarily updating it, which is also the big challenge, especially as these things move slowly, because there's constantly going to be new challenges arising. Massive open online courses were not nearly as big of a deal 2 years ago as they are now. There is a big question about whether or not they are covered by U.S. sanctions, and they've had to, Coursera announced earlier this year that they were blocking their products in sanctioned countries because they were concerned that it was in violation of U.S. sanctions, and they got word from the State Department that, and they wrote about this on their blog, that they were covered for Syria by a general license, and so their products are available in Syria but not Iran, which is really interesting. And these are, this is a basic educational thing, and they may have to go through the course catalog and actually remove certain courses. The nuclear physics one might be harder sell to make available. So there's the scale challenge. So I think there's hope that I think across the board policies that are more clear and consistent is really helpful. Also guidance and outreach and updating them. And one of the big things there is that we've seen, and this has always been true, is that working with civil society, with the people that are actually encountering these challenges on a day-to-day basis, and there's civil society based here in the U.S. that works in these countries, it also requires figuring out how to understand what's going on the ground there and making sure that the policy actually matches up with needs on the ground, which is always a challenge, obviously. And so there's a lot of work to be done. We've definitely seen some progress. I think maybe not as much as one might have hoped, but there's definitely room for a lot more in the next few years. And there's room for, I think, for Sudan in particularly is a good example, that there's a presidential election coming up next year. And there have been a lot of protests, and there is going to be, I think, hopefully a big push for a policy the way we saw with Iran, but faster. Because the challenge was they issued a license 3 weeks before the general election. It's really hard to see real change happen that quickly.
Yeah. We have about 10 minutes, so burning questions, hit us. Otherwise, just shout it out and I'll repeat it for the... So with respect to the export controls, has there been any pushback from the industry? I'm assuming that's for you, Tim.
Not that we're aware of in a public, visible sense. I describe it rather as a holding pattern right now. There have been one company in particular, shortly after the controls came out in December, published a blog post that said that they consider their business to be covered by the new controls, which was slightly confusing to us because our understanding of their business was that it would not be covered, and they are particularly focused on the zero-day trade. So that was interesting, but we are still at a point where this language hasn't actually been implemented in the U.S. export control regime, so nobody actually really knows how this is going to be enforced. So right now is not yet the time, I think, for most actors to take a position on it, because it's unclear how it's actually going to be implemented and whether it's going to be a looser control or a stricter control, and how the actual system is going to be set up to enforce it. So right now I describe it more as a holding pattern. There hasn't been, like, in our work, there hasn't been like outright support where where there was a lot of like in-depth collaboration with companies on this. And after this happened, there wasn't also an outright opposition to it. So it's been very much kind of like, okay, we are looking what's happening, and yeah.
So I had a question along those lines too, Tim, and maybe I missed it in your presentation because I was scribbling some notes, but you talked about the coalition, Privacy International, the German group, y'all that are doing research around this and trying to understand the issue and report on it. But is there anyone taking action, particularly, I don't know, along legal lines? Is there a way that we can do that? How are you guys working, or is your coalition working to make these controls to change them? And I mean, are you just advocating for change? Are you with others like actually taking action? And so how? Sorry if you covered that.
No, this is great. It sounds like we would have coordinated this, but because you give me a chance to now talk about what's called the CAUSE. It's the Coalition Against Unlawful Surveillance Exports, which is a global coalition that we launched in April, together with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a French NGO called International Federation for Human Rights, Privacy International is part of it, Digitale Gesellschaft, OTI here in the US. And this serves as the umbrella coalition for the various organizations that have been focused on this specific topics. And you have a number of organizations that have pursued litigation and that have, particularly in France, tried to actually go after the companies that have been providing these technologies. So there's been a very varied response in terms of how to deal with it. We have focused on the policy analysis of export controls, but a lot of other organizations have actually tried to make the case in court. And I think when we're talking about like companies, it's important to just like, there are obviously huge differences between what kind of companies are we talking about. These are like, if we're talking about Fisher, it's a smaller, medium-sized company called Gamma, and it's very different from like the big internet companies that we usually talk about. So in terms of your question also, like what has been the response, it's kind of like, what kind of companies are we talking about? And the other piece in terms of like concern or is that we've had a lot of conversations with the tech community, partly because there was a concern that this could negatively affect security research and vulnerability researchers. And that was something that we were very concerned about as well and continue to be. And we are trying, like, we've now been able to create relationships with the people in the various governments working on this to make sure that they're aware of it. And this comes with kind of the crypto war experience and there being a concern that this could become a crypto war 2.0, which was part of the reason why we wanted to become involved, so that we could be involved now in the development of this and not have to wait until something is already enacted and then we only have the chance to push back against it. So that was actually really helpful when the controls were created in December, because thanks to like having talked to the people who were involved in developing this language, we knew that the target wasn't the vulnerability researchers, but very much the kind of Fisher and the commercial infrastructure behind it. So that apart from, in addition to the language that tries to make that distinction, we also know that the intent is different from targeting vulnerability researchers. But it's an ongoing concern that we need to make sure that we monitor it so that if anything down the road happens to turn out the way that we did not want to see it, that we can go back to that. Yeah.
Did Gamma have a reaction?
Not that I'm aware of. There's just on an additional note here, the UK government actually used encryption controls to block exports by Gamma last year, which was in response to the public pressure, and the one tool that they had available was the encryption controls in the export control regulations, because there was no other control that would have specifically allowed them to, as a legal basis, to block the control based on a human rights concern over surveillance. So in the recommendations that we published last month with regard to the implementation of the new controls, we explicitly said, we don't think this is a good idea to use encryption controls. Like this will only muddy, like the water will get muddy. You need to have separate controls, because we expect and we advocate for further liberalization of encryption controls, whereas we want stronger surveillance controls. So by having the two separate, you can do the one and the other at the same time. If you start using encryption controls to control surveillance technologies and tools, then how are you going to do that? So we think it's a temporary fix for the problem, because right now we don't have anything else. But we've been trying to make the case for we need something new. So yeah.
To add really quickly, and that's in the U.S., the challenge has been where there have been some court cases and some legal action that have related to the export of certain of equipment to repressive regimes. The challenge has been that the courts have come back and said it's not actually an export control violation, and that's a big problem. And on the question of the encryption controls and sort of like the broader tools, we think about it. The idea is that individuals should be able to communicate freely and securely to the greatest extent possible in these places. So that means ensuring that that products that have encryption, products that are safer and more secure, are made available, while, you know, on the other side, kind of making sure that the idea is that as much as possible to stop the export of these tools, and to make sure that, you know, Western companies are not complicit in these violations. So it's a hard balancing act as well, and that is, I think, one of the things that makes this such a complicated issue, is that you're trying to both prevent the export of certain types of tools that can be used to, you know, for repressive purposes, while making sure that people have as much access as possible, because and trying to minimize that, like, collateral damage in the middle. And it's never perfect. This is always a challenge. Yeah. But the idea is that if you can do that, and you can sort of like open things up legally to the greatest extent possible, you fill that in then with good practice and with good education and greater understanding, and hopefully we can sort of move to a better place.
Yeah, that's a long slog too. Any final questions?
I have one final.
Oh, okay. Tim, please go.
First of all, I'm really impressed that you all came out at 9 a.m. to talk about such a sexy topic of export controls and sanctions. But to leave it on a very positive note, what we've been really impressed by is actually, one, there are very few people that know the space very well. And the response we've gotten from various officials in government, both in the US and abroad, has actually been very, there aren't very many people working on this, so we really welcome your feedback, because it tends to be a very insular discussion among people working on this in government. So they're actually really appreciative of people that have taken the time to look into this. So if any of you have some spare time on your hand and get really excited about this topic, it's definitely an area that is going to continue to pick up. And actually, one of the concerns that I think we as a community have moving forward is, as this continues to pick up in the next few years, how do you guarantee a sustained engagement in this? And there are no institutions in place right now. So the more people are interested in this and look into this, the better.
Nothing else burning? No? All right. Well, thanks, you guys. Thanks for coming this morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.